So good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. It's really nice to see such a good turnout. I have been at the Maritime Museum since 2012 as Director of Education, and I kind of got the Lighthouse by default. I kind of came under the Education Director's purview, and I've sort of been obsessed with the Rondout Lighthouse ever since. And I decided to put this talk together this year because I found a list of Lighthouse Keepers that the U.S. Coast Guard put together. And a fair number of them were from New York, which I thought was really interesting. And a good chunk of those were Hudson River Lighthouse Keepers. So I'm going to start by, since I don't know how much you guys actually know about lighthouses, I'm going to start with the 3rd Lighthouse District. Lighthouses in the United States up until the 1940s were operated by the federal government in its own branch. Forget the title that they used. It started in like the 1790s. I forget the original title, but later it was called the U.S. Lighthouse Service. I see Anna smiling. Do you remember the original title?
It was Lighthouse Establishment.
Yes, thank you. The U.S. Lighthouse Establishment later becomes the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And its sole role within the federal government is to manage and staff lighthouses across the country. So the Hudson River is in the 3rd Lighthouse District, which also includes the coasts of Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Long Island. We have a little zoom in here, which shows a number of the lighthouses along the Hudson River. This isn't all of them, I don't think, but it's a good chunk. And you can see up in the Albany area there are a number of lighthouses which no longer exist. And you can see kind of right next to that little pop-out box of the Albany area is the Rondout Lighthouse, which is that way, about a mile. I'm just going to do a brief overview of some of the chronology of the Hudson River lighthouses that still exist. This is not a comprehensive list, but I'm going to be talking about most of these lighthouses today. So in 1823, the Lake Champlain Canal opened. It was the first canal to open in New York State, connecting Lake Champlain to the Hudson River. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened. In 1826, the Stony Point Lighthouse was built. That's the oldest lighthouse on the Hudson River, and it was opened as a direct response to the opening of the Erie Canal. In 1828, the Delaware and Hudson Canal opened and terminated here on the Rondout Creek at Eddyville, just up the creek from us. And you can see there's a number of lighthouses opened in the 1830s. You have 1829, the Stuyvesant Lighthouse is opened, destroyed by an ice dam in 1832, which we will get into later. It was rebuilt in 1835. Also in 1835, the original wooden Saugerties Lighthouse was built, destroyed by fire in 1848, and I might ask, we have one of the Saugerties Lighthouse Keepers here, so I might ask her to chime in if I forget anything. In 1837, the first of 3 Rondout lighthouses was built, torn down in 1867. In 1838, the original Esopus Meadows Lighthouse was built. 1850, the Saugerties Lighthouse was rebuilt. 1852, we have the Schodack Channel Light. There's not actually a lighthouse with a house attached to it. Up in the Albany area. In 1853, we had the West Point Lighthouse. Another similar thing, is not actually a house. Same with 1854 and the New Baltimore Stake Light. 1867, Rondout 2, which is on the Port Ewan side. Anybody who's kayaked or boated out of Rondout Creek, you can see that round blue stone foundation on your right there as you leave them off the creek. That's that lighthouse. The second Stuyvesant Lighthouse in 1868. The second Saugerties Lighthouse in 1869, the second Esopus Meadows Lighthouse in 1871, the Hudson Athens Lighthouse in 1874, and the 3rd Rondout Lighthouse in 1915, which is still there. All right, so I did this talk before, and I didn't talk about what Lighthouse Keepers actually did, and someone took me to task about that, so we're going to talk a little bit about what they actually did. Their main duties were to light and maintain the lantern. So that included cleaning the lamp, the Fresnel lens, and the glass on the outside of the tower. They had to fill the lamp oil reservoirs and maintain the wicks. they had to wind the light turning mechanism. So that was, before electricity, that was how lighthouse lights actually turned. There was a clockwork mechanism, and they looked sort of like window weights on old-fashioned windows that would fall the length of the tower. And you would wind it up. They would wind the weights all the way up to the tower, and they would slowly fall. And as they fell, the light would turn at a speed specific to the lighthouse. Sometimes those had to be wound as often as every 4 hours. So if you're a lighthouse keeper, you didn't necessarily get a lot of sleep. Same with ringing the fog bell. Later, they did have more automatic fog bells, where same thing with the lighthouse turning mechanism. You would wind them up, and they would ring for a certain number of hours, usually 3 or 4 hours. But the original ones, you had to ring by hand. And if there was fog out there for a long time, you'd have to continue ringing that fog bell until the fog burned away or did whatever. You had to keep impeccable records. You worked for the federal government, so you had to keep records of all the materials you used, like your schedule of cleaning, everything that went on, and you had to rescue any distressed persons possible. So as a lighthouse keeper, especially since many of the Hudson River lighthouses are out in the water, not on land, lighthouse keepers were often first responders for any nearby boating accidents, people falling through the ice, seaplanes crashing, all this stuff. Lighthouse keepers are usually the first responders there. They would have to write up pretty extensive reports, and some of our lighthouse keepers hated doing that, so they wouldn't actually report their rescues, which is terrible for historians because then we don't have any record of what actually happened. But yeah, the paperwork got to some people and they didn't like to do that. So these following pictures are not related to the Hudson River. I just wanted to have some illustrations for the types of things they do. So here's a woman cleaning the Fresnel lens, which is a combination of prisms and magnifying lenses that would go around, in this case, an electric light, although early on they were oil lamps. And that would help magnify the light to make it brighter so it could shine further out. This is the guy cleaning the exterior glass of a tower. This actually looks a lot like the exterior of the 1915 Rondout Lighthouse tower. This is the guy refilling the oil lamp. And you can see that wick that's like curved, which I thought was cool. This is actually the West Point Lighthouse I found, and he is winding up the mechanism to turn the tower light. And then that's a fog bell. Yeah. Not all of them were this big. Most of the ones in the Hudson River were smaller because they didn't have to go as far because the Hudson River is not super big. All right, so the Erie Canal opening. This picture is from New York City in 1825, and it's the celebration of the opening of the Erie Canal. And I wanted to have it on here to give you an idea of what the Hudson River looked like most of the time after the Erie Canal opened. Boat traffic on the Hudson River increased exponentially after the Erie Canal opened, especially after the D&H Canal opened. And that really meant that with that many boats on the river, you needed lighthouses not only to mark places where you might want to stop or where traffic was coming in and out of, like Rondout Creek, but also places where you definitely did not want to go, like Esopus Meadows. Is everybody familiar with the Esopus Meadows Lighthouse? For those of you who don't know, the Esopus Meadows Lighthouse is the last wooden lighthouse on the Hudson River. It's in the middle, it looks like it's in the middle of the river. But between the lighthouse and the west side of the river is the Esopus Meadows, which is, at low tide, is only a couple of feet deep. It's a very shallow area. It's very easy to run aground there if you have a boat of any size. So this increased traffic really is what spurred a lot of lighthouse construction on the Hudson River. These are our women lighthouse keepers that we know of Hudson River, the official ones. Christina Whitbeck, who ran the Stuyvesant Lighthouse from 1841 to 1853. Her daughter Anne took over until 1866. Katherine Murdoch, our favorite, who ran the multiple Rondout Lighthouses from 1857 to 1907. We'll get into that later. Nancy Rose, who ran Stony Point from 1857 to 1904. Her daughter at the bottom, Melinda Rose, later takes over for a year. Joanna Lackey and Elisha Smith, pretty much all we have are their names and dates of service. Could not find anything else on them, but we'll get into that later. And Kate Crowley, for the Sardi's Lighthouse from 1873 to 1885. So we're going to start with the Stuyvesant Lighthouse. This is a picture of the 1835 lighthouse from sometime before 1902, which is when it was abandoned and destroyed in an ice flow. So the Whitbecks, Volkert Whitbeck was the first lighthouse keeper in 1830. The first lighthouse was built in 1829, and he became lighthouse keeper in 1830 upon its completion. And in 1832, that lighthouse was destroyed by an ice dam. And I have an article from, it's a letter to the editor, to the American Railroad Journal. Don't ask me why I went to the American Railroad Journal, but here it is. From March 24th, 1832. And I'm going to read it to you, because the story is very affecting, and I didn't want to summarize it. So here we go. Melancholy occurrence. On Tuesday last, about 12 o'clock p.m., the ice on the Hudson River at Stuyvesant Landing began to give way. The river had at that time risen to an unusual height, the water being 12 feet above low water mark, covering the docks to the depths of 4 feet, and making an entrance into most of the storehouses on the wharves. These buildings were uninjured. The ice continued to move for about 2 hours, and apparently in one solid mass, several miles in extent. During this interval, a most distressing scene was witnessed at the upper lighthouse, situated 1.5 miles above the landing. That's Scotac Landing. This was a stone building, 20 feet by 34 and 2 stories high, with a mole surrounding it 4 feet in height. A mole is like a piece of land that comes out into the water. The water had risen to the top of the mole before the ice began to move, which rendered the situation of the inmates of the lighthouse truly alarming. Soon the immense field of ice above was seen to swing from its moorings and come down with irresistible force. It struck the lighthouse, which in a moment was made a heap of ruins. The following letter contains a very moving account of the accident. Stuyvesant Landing, Tuesday evening, March 13, 1832. To the editor of the Kinderhook Sentinel. Sir, I am about to record one of the most afflicting and singular providences I ever witnessed. The Hudson River had been rising for more than 24 hours when the ice began to give way. It was thought that the lighthouse, standing 1 mile above the landing, was in danger of being injured by the large bodies of ice which were floating down the river. About 12 o'clock today, 2 gentlemen, with great difficulty, made the lighthouse in a small boat, as it was now standing in and entirely surrounded by water. They advised Mr. Whitbeck, the occupant of the house, to leave it, together with his family, immediately. They accordingly made preparations to do so, by removing their furniture into the upper story and making a comfortable disposition of their cows and other stock. When ready to leave their threatened home, suddenly and with terrible violence, the ice came rushing upon the house. They were startled by one awful and tremendous crash, and in less than a minute, the whole 2-story stone edifice was a mingled heap of ruins. The family, consisting of 10 persons, with the exception of one, were in the building when it fell. 4 of them disappeared and were either buried beneath the ruins or swept off by the impetuous flood. 2 daughters of Mr. Whitbeck, one aged 15 and the other 13, and 2 of his grandsons, one 14 and the other 2, were victims of this dire catastrophe. By timely assistance afforded by the 2 gentlemen alluded to, who were near in a boat, 6 out of the 10 were saved. The survivors were badly bruised, and on reaching the shore were so chilled and exhausted that they were unable to walk. They were taken to a house nearby and made as comfortable as circumstances would admit. I am informed that it is not expected Mrs. Whitbeck will recover, and that the recovery of the other members of the family is considered very doubtful. I have seen and conversed with Mr. Whitbeck this evening. He was as comfortable as I expected to find him, but he was a man of sorrows and afflicted with grief. My heart moved within me when I saw the man and heard him speak. His eyes were suffused with tears when he spoke of the calamity which had bereft him of his dear children. The sympathies of all the bystanders were so excited in his that they wept. But I could endure it no longer when he raised his streaming eyes toward heaven and cried in the agony of his heart and soul, "Oh, my children, where are they?" This family is now left in a destitute condition to share the lot of the suffering and the poor. Yours, John Allen. So we're going to start on a depressing note. So Mrs. Whitbeck does indeed recover and outlives her husband. We don't really know how Volker Whitbeck dies. There was kind of a challenge even tracking him down at all, what his first name really was. But Christina does survive him and becomes Lighthouse Keeper. This story sort of makes the rounds, and the president at the time, I believe, was Martin Van Buren. And basically a bunch of people petition him to keep the Whitbecks on the payroll until a new lighthouse can be built, which they do. So they are not destitute, thankfully. So there's sort of a happy ending there. So Christina becomes Lighthouse Keeper in 1841, and something happens to her in 1853. Either she retires or she dies. We don't really know what happens. And Anne takes over and is Lighthouse Keeper until 1866. This is the article that I read. This is a hilarious newspaper article. It's from 1861, and it says, Anne Whitbeck is the lighthouse keeper at Stuyvesant on the Hudson River, some 20 miles from Albany. She was appointed to that position by the president in the year 1832. Since which time she has retained it. The salary is $350 per annum. Her husband was the keeper of the lighthouse previous to that time. In that year, the lighthouse was carried away in a freshet, and Mr. Whitbeck was killed. Mrs. Whitbeck has an only daughter named Anne. And between them, they managed to perform the duties pertaining to the office. So this is the moral of the story: don't always trust what the newspapers in the time period say. Which happened a lot in my research for this. You know, various people died of various illnesses in different times, which you kind of have to sift through and like, all right, what's the most common one of all the newspaper articles to figure out what actually happened. But that is all I could find about Stuyvesant Lighthouse and the Whitbecks. Not a lot has been digitized and is available online. So, and we don't have a lot in our collection. So there is additional research that can be done there, should anyone be interested in it. All right, we're going to move on to Stony Point, 1826. This picture is actually from a drawing from 1846, but I just thought it was nice to have an earlier image of it. This photo is from the 1900s, I think about 1904, and you can see that unlike most of the other lighthouses on the Hudson River, this lighthouse, the lighthouse itself is separate, and then there was a separate keeper's dwelling. So Stony Point was kept by the Roses for a really long time. Originally kept by Alexander Rose. If you give me a second to find my sheets, which I didn't have put in order. There we go. So Alexander Rose was sort of a native to the area. He was a member of his wife Nancy was a member of the Parkinson family, who are apparently a very well-known family in the Stony Point area. Alexander Rose became lighthouse keeper in 1853, and he was carrying timber in 1857 for the construction of the new bell tower at the Stony Point Lighthouse when he ruptured a blood vessel and then passed away, leaving his wife Nancy to look after their 6 children, only 2 of whom survived to adulthood. She becomes lighthouse keeper in 1857. She is lighthouse keeper until 1904. I've also seen 1903 and other points. She dies in 1904 at the age of 80, at which point her daughter, who's in her 50s, Melinda Rose, takes over as lighthouse keeper, but only for a year because the salary is not enough to live on. Okay, so toward the end of her career, Nancy Rose, she's very beloved in Stony Point and Rockland County. There were lots of articles about, oh, she's been keeper for so long, and the Hudson River has so many more female lighthouse keepers than New England, because of course, if anybody knows anything about women lighthouse keepers, Ida Lewis is the super famous one, and anybody who's read Keep the Lights Burning Abby, that was another famous young woman who was lighthouse keeper in Maine. And the writer of the newspaper article was upset that they were getting all of the attention when, look, we have these great long-serving women on the Hudson River and we deserve attention too. So her career as lighthouse keeper was pretty unremarkable. Nothing terrible really ever happened. The worst thing that happened was in 1901, the steamer Poughkeepsie ran up on the rocks near Stony Point in a fog, and like 40 passengers were stranded for a while. Pretty much the worst that ever happened. It is difficult for the innkeeper of Stony Point Lighthouse to do any real rescues because it's on top of a cliff, so it's not really that easy to get down to the water. But I have another newspaper article about this wreck of the Poughkeepsie, and I want to read it to you because it's very interesting. So the title is, Mrs. Rose was ringing the bell when the boat went ashore. And then it says, trying to fix the blame. And then it says, the horses rescued on Sunday, much of the freight ruined by water. The Chapman Wrecking Company, with a flotilla of wrecking boats, and the Great Derrick Monarch, which actually we have the hoisting engine from a Monarch in our collection, which is pretty cool, is working on the wreck of the steamer Poughkeepsie, which ran on the rocks on the north side of Stony Point in the storm of last Tuesday night, have succeeded in floating the wrecked steamer. The wreckers worked unceasingly during Saturday and Sunday in getting the freight out of the stranded vessel. The horses were rescued on Sunday. Notwithstanding they had been standing knee-deep in ice-cold water for 3 days, were apparently uninjured when they reached Newburgh, where they were taken and properly cared for. Good job, we care about horses. Okay. Much of the freight is of a perishable nature and is of course ruined. There was a quantity of printed matter from Poughkeepsie, several tons of paper from the Adams and Bishop's mills at Newburgh, tobacco from Kingston, and fruit from Marlborough and other Hudson River towns, which had been preserved in cellars and vaults during the winter, and is of course a total loss. There was a large quantity of agricultural machinery that will have to be repolished and cleaned. The loss has not been ascertained and will not be until the boat is put in the dry dock and the damage to the 800 tons of freight that was on board has been estimated. Major Weston of Newburgh, who is president of the company, is trying to lay the blame on Mrs. Nancy Rose, who has charge of the bell and the lighthouse. He told a Newburgh Register reporter on Sunday, the river in the vicinity of Stony Point is peculiar in some respects, and this probably caused the erection of a double precautionary signal. There are at times sections of the river enshrouded with patches of fog, while a few hundred feet away there is not a particle of this barrier to be seen. In order to guard against this, particularly in damp and muggy weather, the fog bell is kept ringing, as well as the light burning. The bell is fitted with an attachment whereby it is run continuously for 4 hours after winding. The lighthouse keeper is an aged lady who lives on the point with her son and daughter. When the son is home, he attends the lighted bell. He was in Albany on Wednesday, and the aged mother and sister attended the work. The bell rings 4 hours. Mrs. Rose said the bell was set going at 9 p.m. This would bring the hour for it to stop at 1 o'clock. From this, it would appear there was an effort to shift the responsibility for the accident. The statement of the president and that of the pilot at the wrecked boat does not agree. Pilot Charles Lee is considered one of the best pilots on the river. He has followed the river many years and never before ran a boat ashore or had an accident. When asked about it, he said he had nothing to say except that it was a thick, dark night. That Mrs. Rose, who has been in charge of the lighthouse for almost 50 years, was on guard and the bell was ringing, there is little, if any, doubt. The people who live in the vicinity say the bell was ringing, and in support of this is the statement of the pilot. The Poughkeepsie Eagle has this to say regarding pilots taking chances in running their boats on the river without reference to compass, by which all Marines are presumed to guide themselves. The pilots make very close and very good guesses, is shown from the fact that the shore is rarely hit. But the night the Poughkeepsie sank, the pilot made a fatal mistake of guessing twice. He took the right course and kept it the right length of time, and from his own testimony, he thought to hear the bell. But as he did not, he guessed again and kept on. If he had heeded his first guess and stopped the boat for a minute, he would have heard the bell and saved his boat. But keeping on against his own better judgment cost him his boat. When it is only a matter of a half a minute anyway, It speaks wonders for the pilots that they don't hit the shore nearly as often as they miss it. The Poughkeepsie was successfully floated and towed to Erie Basin on Thursday. So, I love that article because here is some bigwig company guy trying to blame poor Mrs. Rose for his own folly, and the newspaper and people in the community are like, nope. She did her job and you messed up. So, she retires in 1903, 1904, there's a couple different newspaper articles saying one or the other. But in 1903, she is awarded a service medal from Scenic and Historic Society. What that is, I have no idea. But they gave her a medal made by Tiffany and Company, which was kind of cool. And by 1904, she dies at the age of 80, and her daughter Melinda takes over as lighthouse keeper, but as I said, just for 1 year, because she found the salary inadequate. And that's Mrs. Nancy Rose right there in the corner. Okay, Rondout Lighthouse. We're going in chronological order when the lighthouses were built, if anybody is wondering. So, Rondout Lighthouse was built in 1837. We used to say that this is the only known image of the Rondout Lighthouse. It's from an 1845 Hudson River panorama, which if anybody has time has been digitized online, and I recommend giving it a look. It has a drawing of the entire coastline on both sides of the Hudson River in 1845. So it's pretty cool to look at some of the stuff that you can see. However, a couple of weeks ago, I found this image, which is a Jervis McAtee painting of the Rondout. And I was looking at it, and I thought, oh, look, there's something there at the mouth of Rondout Creek. What's that? It's the lighthouse! Second known image! Yay! So I thought that was really cool that we found another image of it. It appears to have been painted white, which kind of lines up with some of the other lighthouses. A little wooden structure right in the middle of the creek there. Which of course is not great to have a wooden structure in the middle of a body of water. And it's especially not great to have a wooden structure in the middle of a body of water that you have boats coming in and out of all the time. So although this was fine in 1837 to mark the entrance to the creek, it didn't stay that way. And they moved it, which we'll get to in a minute. But in the meantime, in 1856, a family by the name of Murdoch moved into that little wooden lighthouse at the mouth of Rondout Creek. George and Katherine Murdoch had 2 children, George Jr. and Emma, when they moved into that lighthouse, and Katherine was pregnant with their 3rd child, James, down there in the corner. So they move in, everything's all fine for the first 6 months, and then one day George goes to shore in their little rowing boat to get some groceries. And he doesn't come back. And they find him floating in the water beside his boat full of groceries. So nobody knows really what actually happens there. Some people like to speculate that he stopped in the tavern on his way home and got drunk and fell in the boat, but there's no real evidence as to what actually happened, other than that he drowned and died and left Catherine with 2 little kids and a brand new baby by herself in this lighthouse. Now Catherine was a local girl. Catherine Parcell grew up in Port Ewan, so she had a lot of supporters in this area. And a number of them wrote letters in support of her becoming the lighthouse keeper. So there was a fair amount of competition for lighthouse jobs. It was considered a fairly easy job. It came with a house and provisions, which didn't happen very often in the 19th century in terms of jobs. And there was some competition for this particular station, but whether or not she actually went down to DC, I can't find evidence one way or the other, but that's the story, is that she went down to DC, children and baby James in tow with her letters in hand, and went to the U.S. Lighthouse Service headquarters and said, please let me be lighthouse keeper. And if you do, little baby James is going to grow up to be a lighthouse keeper, and what better training than to grow up in a lighthouse to be a lighthouse keeper? Which of course is exactly what happened. So they let her become lighthouse keeper. And she starts out in that little wooden lighthouse. And she serves there until 1867. Right, so, ta-da. She's appointed, she's technically a lighthouse keeper, officially lighthouse keeper for 50 years. She retires in 1907, but she actually kept the lighthouse for the remainder of 1856. So in some instances you'll see 50 years, in some instances you'll see 51, and that's the discrepancy. So this is the 1867 Rondout Lighthouse, which is a big, beautiful bluestone lighthouse. No longer there, sadly. We'll get into why in a minute. And the wooden one was torn down. And that's because it was in the middle of the creek, kind of in the way, old rickety lighthouse. So they moved the lighthouse location to the south side of the creek off the shore of Slatesburg, over in Fort Union. And you can see, anybody know what that little white building is out there? So this is a little story from Mrs. Murdock kept a very Victorian scrapbook. It's not very big, but we have it in our collection, and the first 2 pages are devoted entirely to lighthouse news. Unfortunately, that's the only stuff that's in there that has to do with the lighthouse. The rest of it is sort of general Hudson River news, poetry, all kinds of Victorian scrapbook things. But this undated newspaper from approximately the 1880s, there's this little section that says, "One morning before the dikes were built, Mrs. Murdoch sat in her little room sewing. Suddenly her ears were greeted with a crash of glass. She turned around and saw a schooner's boom had entered this window and stuck halfway across the room. The schooner had been crowded into the lighthouse by a tow." So there's a steamboat or tugboat possibly with a tow line coming in or out of the creek, and they're basically running the schooner off the road, so to speak, and into the lighthouse.
Is it called the Lighthouse?
Oh, sorry, no, that's a typo on my part. It's Murdoch. It's Katherine Murdoch's scrapbook. I did not catch that. Good, no, it's Murdoch. So, this is another really great map that we discovered in the past 2 years, which shows the construction of the dikes at the mouth of Rondout Creek. So you can see, I'm just going to talk really loudly and point. So this is the original north side of the river, and the original south side of the river is actually over here. It's actually off the map. This canal boat basin, that is now all land. It is filled in because after the B&H Canal closed in 1898, there was that little basin there, and they piled all their wooden canal boats there that were sunk, and then stuff grew up on top of that. So that's now all land. So we think the original wooden lighthouse is somewhere in here. This is the 1867 lighthouse. You can't really see it on here, but all of these sections are dated. So the first section was right here of that breakwater, that jetty that they put in, which was put in 1877. So the lighthouse was built in 1867, and 10 years later they put in that first dike. And the rest of the dikes were completed in 1879. And they did that because they dredged the mouth of the creek. The mouth of the creek was kind of filling in with silt and sediment thanks to the tides. So they dredged the mouth of the creek and built those dikes to keep the channel deep and open. But when they did that, all of a sudden, the lighthouse is all the way back here, and the mouth of the creek is all the way out here. So what they did is they put these little orange dots, or lights, just little lanterns, that Catherine, and by this point her son James, who was assistant keeper, would have to maintain. The tugboat and steamboat captains were really not happy about that arrangement, because it's not very easy to see little lanterns on poles at night when there's walls in the water. So they actually petitioned the federal government to build a new lighthouse, which got approved in 1910. Construction started in 1913, and it was built in 1915, and it looks like that. And I love this picture because you can see the original, what the original dikes look like. So at some point, they chopped off all of those pilings, which now at high tide are covered up, and occasionally you'll see somebody in a sailboat or a motorboat hung up, especially on the south side, because they don't know that wall is there, and they think, oh, I'm going to turn it around that creek, and right on top of that wall. So that's what it looked like originally. Okay, so remember I talked about the boom crashing into the lighthouse before the dikes were built? Those are the dikes that they were talking about. So her next, Katherine Murdoch says her most exciting / terrifying time in the Rondout Lighthouse, which I printed out. Sarah, I can summarize. Was the flood of 1878, which is another big freshet. Before we had dams on all of our tributaries, that was a common thing. If there was a lot of snow over the winter and you had a quick thaw in the spring, all of that meltwater off of the mountains would come rushing down. It would get stuck behind ice dams, and the ice dams would break, and it would cause a huge flood. So Katherine Murdoch recounts this giant flood that happened in 1878, which actually broke the dam at Eddyville. Buildings were going down the Rondout, all sorts of crazy things. And her friends, who knew that this pressure was coming, tried to get her to leave. And she said, even though I am a woman, I'm a lighthouse keeper, and I'm going to stay and keep the light. So remember, she's in this nice big bluestone castle, her little castle on the water, they called it, not the rickety wooden one. So it's maybe less terrifying prospect than you might think, but still scary. So the dam breaks. The ice dam breaks and all this water comes rushing down, including a barn with chickens and a horse in it. So the barn is just floating along these floodwaters. It sounds funny, it's actually pretty terrifying. So it hits the Slatesburg side, and Katherine Murdoch says in the morning she looks out her window, and in the ruins of this broken barn is this horse standing shivering on the remains of this barn, where the lighthouse is along those that dike there. And before anybody can get out to rescue it, it jumps in the water and swims to shore, apparently unharmed. Which is kind of a great story. She is also unharmed, the lighthouse is unharmed, but pretty much everything else is harmed. Dozens of boats broke loose from their moorings, went careening down the Rondout. All kinds of buildings were completely destroyed. The whole waterfront was flooded. It was a pretty awful event. So that was her scariest event, being lighthouse keeper. In 1880, just 2 years after that flood, James was officially appointed assistant lighthouse keeper with his own salary, even though she stays on as head keeper with her existing salary. They add him as assistant keeper with his own salary. So I think by this point we know he's really doing all of the work. Yeah, running up and down those stairs. Maybe she's doing some of the lantern cleaning, but at some unknown point she remarries a guy named Jeremiah Perkins, who I can't find very much out about. And they have another son named William. And in 1907 she retires after 50 years of service and moves ashore to Kankakee. She moves in with her son William. And in 1909, she dies at the age of 81. So, lighthouse keeper for pretty much her whole life. That's Catherine. This is her death notice. Mrs. Catherine Perkins, she remarried, died Wednesday evening at 7:30 o'clock at the residence of her son William Perkins in Kankakee after a long illness, aged 81 years. Mrs. Perkins was born in the town of Esopus and married George Murdoch about 60 years ago, and later married Jeremiah Perkins, who died several years ago, so both of her husbands predeceased her. She leaves 3 sons, George Murdoch of Brooklyn, James Murdoch, keeper of the Rondout Lighthouse, and William Perkins of Kankakee, and 2 daughters, Emma, wife of Joel Reitmeyer of Kingston, and Mary, wife of George Murdoch, so daughter and daughter-in-law of New York City, and 1 brother, Abram Parcell of Arlington, New Jersey, and 1 sister, Mrs. Eliza Rodman of Port Ewan. Mrs. Murdoch was the keeper of the Rondout Creek Lighthouse for 51 years, officially 50, but technically 51. Her husband was appointed the keeper of the Rondout Light in 1856 by President Pierce, and a month later her husband was drowned. It's not really a month, but that's okay. And since his death, until she resigned 2 years ago, she was keeper of the light. All that time she was well known and highly respected by all. After her resignation, her son James took the position. The funeral will be private, and the interment will be in the family plot in the Port Ewan Cemetery. And that's where she still is. So Rondout Lighthouse didn't have another female lighthouse keeper, but there were some other ladies who lived there between George Murdoch and the end of civilian life-keeping at the Rondout, and that was the Howard family. Robert Howard was lightkeeper there from 1938 to 1945. We're in the 19th century. Lila Howard was the older daughter. Esther was the younger. They moved there when Esther was 9. And Esther left some reminiscences with us about growing up in the lighthouse. So she talks about how the channel was forbidden to her for swimming. But one day she went and swam it anyway. And never told anyone until she told us, which was kind of cool. And she understood why she wasn't allowed to swim, because it was filthy and cold and super deep, and there was garbage and giant scary boats, and she went out in it and then never went in it again. She and Lila did play a lot in the flats behind the lighthouse. So you can see this area behind the jetty is behind those walls that are keeping the channel clear. And so it got pretty shallow back there. A lot of sediment has filled in. They had a little boat. They would go tootling around in the summer. They would go swimming. In the winter, they would go ice skating because it would freeze. Esther and Lila attended the number 4 Liberty Street School in Pencockie. And in the wintertime, they would walk across the ice. And Esther had a reminiscence about one day they were walking across and she fell through the ice. Luckily, her sister Lila was there and hauled her out. And they walked back to the house, got changed, got all dried off and warmed up. And then their mother sent them back out to go to school. So, luckily she did have a sister, because otherwise it gets kind of lonely, especially in the summertime at the lighthouse, although they did have friends over from time to time. They had a car and a garage on land, so like on Saturday afternoons they would go and see movies and stuff, but they always had to be back by dark to keep the light lit. Some more fun pictures. Unfortunately, Robert Howard also died in service of the Rondout Lighthouse. The winter of 1945, he was helping some people who'd gotten their boat stuck in the ice, and he fell on the ice and hit his head and had a stroke, and later died in the hospital. So he and his family were the last civilian lighthouse keepers at Rondout Lighthouse. After that, they had Coast Guard keepers, because of course, by the end of the war, the U.S. Lighthouse Service had been absorbed by the Coast Guard. And then in 1954, it was fully automated. I talked about what was going to happen to, where is it? This lighthouse. This lighthouse was boarded up and abandoned in 1915 when the new one was built. And also in the mid-1950s, the roof collapsed because it had just been boarded up and abandoned and neglected. And of course, that was like the favorite hangout of kids, and people go fishing, and teenagers, I'm sure, get into all sorts of trouble. So the Coast Guard and the powers that be in Port Ewan decided it was a hazard, and that it needed to be torn down. But it's out in the middle of the creek. How do you get a wrecking ball out there? You don't. You fill it with dynamite and blow it up. Which is what happened. They collapsed it into the basement, and all that rubble is still there.
Wow.
In the basement. Because we went and looked. We're like, hey, look at that big brown platform. Let's just cut all the brush back. And people kept like putting stuff there and stuff. And we started cutting. We got about 3 feet in, and there was a giant hole. With a tree about this big growing out of the middle of it. So, yep. That's the sad end of that lighthouse. Luckily, the other one is still there. Okay. Now, Anna's going to correct me if I get anything wrong. So, the Sardis Lighthouse was built in 1835, the first one. This is also from that 1845 Hudson River panorama. See, it's a little 2-story wooden structure off the coast there, so out in the water. It was replaced in 1869 by the brick lighthouse, which looks a lot like the Rondout Lighthouse, and that is because all lighthouses in the United States that were built in the same couple of years were built from the same plans. So Rondout was built of bluestone and Sardis were built of brick, but it was the same architectural plans. The Crowleys are who we're going to talk about with our female lighthouse keepers today. So Dennis Crowley, who's the father, was a lighthouse keeper from 1865 to 1865. I don't know exactly how long he was lighthouse keeper, but his son Daniel took over for a number of years, and then his daughter Kate takes over. Where's my notes here? Here we go. Yes, says Dennis was removed from service after just 3 months. Not really sure why, but there are some references later to her father having cataracts and going blind. So I think that was probably the reason. So Kate kind of grew up in the lighthouse with her sister Ellen, and she loved being in the water. She's a swimmer, she's a rower, she's a very gung-ho kind of girl, not, you know, your frail, retiring Victorian damsel there. And in the 1870s, there were a series of newspaper articles about them, Kate and Ellen. And one of them is from the New York Times, and it printed out pretty okay, so I'm going to try and read it for you. It says, Kate and Ellen Crowley, the maidens who take care of the Saugerties Light. They live in a lighthouse not over 120 miles from New York on the Hudson River. Keep it themselves, and their home is always, their flame is always trimmed and burning. On a foggy night when the light is not visible, you can hear one of them a mile off blowing a foghorn herself. For the government has been too mercenary to give them one of the automatic kind. Moreover, they have saved many lives. Miss Kate C. Crowley is the mistress and keeper of Saugerties Lighthouse. She is capable of any daring deed involving danger or self-sacrifice. And as to the manner in which the lighthouse is kept, it is unexcelled. Accounts are always kept right, the light is always burning, and Miss Crowley is the very best kind of keeper. It was a bright starlit night, and the writer sat in the pilot house, talking to the steersman, who guided the steamer safely through the shadows of the frowning peak of the Highlands, and answered questions, or volunteered information, between the rotations of the wheel. As we turned a bend in the river, a light that looked like a star of the first magnitude twinkled far away in the distance. That's 15 miles away, said the man at the wheel. That's Saugerties Light. We'll lose it again in downtimes in the turns of the river. Do I know the girls? Well, no, not to speak to him, but I seen him in the river many a time by daylight, pulling away a great heavy rowboat that no two rivermen would dare handle in one of them gales that sweep down through the mountains. It ain't like a tumultuous sea, hey? Well, oh my gosh, I can't read this. Well, that just shows how little you know about these northern river storms. Why, when we get some of these hurricanes blasts, they sweep down through the gaps from the north, and another current comes up from the south, and God help any vessel that gets caught in a maelstrom when they meet. Well, it was on one of those occasions. I was coming up the river on the old Columbus after she got out of carrying passengers and took to the towing business. It's very vernacular here. We got a little north of Rondout, and I was all alone at the wheel. I heard a rumbling behind me, and I looked around, and I saw a great big cloud with thunderheads rushing up from the south. I knew we were going to catch a ripper. This was nothing, however, to the heavy clouds that came sweeping down from the north. In a disturbance on one of these occasions, I was coming, to the heavy clouds that came sweeping down from the north in the opposite direction. And then I saw that the two storms would meet. I hollered down the trumpet to the engineer to slower the engine, and made up my mind to keep headway and stay in the river, as it would be unsafe to try and make a landing. In a few minutes, the two storms struck us. The boat cavorted like a frisky horse, and in the foaming water plunged and reared and shook in every timber. We were then pretty nearly abreast of Tivoli, and Saugerties Lighthouse was only about 2 miles ahead. A sloop loaded with bluestone, which had just put out from the mouth of Esopus Creek and was standing down the river, went over when the squall struck her. And soon I saw 2 men struggling in the water. Hardly a minute elapsed before 2 female forms were fluttering around a small boat by the lighthouse. In another minute, it was launched, and it bobbed up and down in the seething, foaming waters. The 2 girls, bareheaded with a pair of oars apiece, began pulling toward the men in the water. The waves ran so high, and the gale blew so madly, and the thunder roared so incessantly, and the lightning flashed in such blinding sheets, that it seemed impossible for the women to reach those men, to keep headway, or to keep from being swamped. But they never missed the opportunity of a rising billow to give them leverage, and they managed by steady pulling to get ahead until they reached the men in the water. The great danger was that the tossing boat would strike the sailors and end their career. But one of the gals leaned over the bow of the boat, braced her feet beneath the seat on which she had been sitting, stiffened herself out for a great effort, and as her sister kept the bow of the craft crosswise to the waves, caught one of the men beneath his arms as he struck out on top of a billow, lifted and threw him by main force into the middle of the boat, and then prepared for the other man. He had got hold of the sloop's rudder, which had got unshipped and was floating on the water. He let go and swam toward the rowboat, and was hauled in also by the woman and his half-drowned comrade. You couldn't get any river boatman to do what those girls did. So that gives you Kate and Ellen Crowley in kind of a nutshell. This is a tale that makes its way across the country. I found a reference to a newspaper in Illinois printing that story, which was kind of cool. That's some of the only reference material that I could find about them. So they were these heroic girls who were lighthouse keepers for a little over 10 years, and then James Crowley, who's Daniel's son, takes over, and that's about all I know about Kate Crowley, unless Miss Anna has anything to contribute.
What was the question?
Did they ever get married, the two girls?
I don't know.
They probably did, they shanghaied my husband.
Yeah, there you go. We're right in the boat, right? Took off with them. Yeah, there you go. Two guys missing.
They didn't dare leave.
Yeah. I just thought that was the greatest description of her hooking her feet under the seat of the boat, leaning out and hauling the guy in. Yep, love it. So here's the whole article. It keeps going, I only read the first half of it because I didn't want to go too long. So, Ruth Reynolds was not a lighthouse keeper technically herself. Her husband was a lighthouse keeper, but she loved the Saris Lighthouse. And basically when it was threatened with being destroyed, she got together with a group of people and founded the Saris Lighthouse Conservancy. She also got the Saris Lighthouse on the National Register, and she wrote a book, which is currently out of print, but you can find it used occasionally, Lighthouses and Legends of the Hudson, which talks about Hudson River lighthouses.
In a way, she is a keeper.
She really is.
Yeah, you're right.
She was never officially on the payroll, but she definitely kept that lighthouse, that's for sure.
She was a keeper of the light.
She was actually the wife of Chester Glenn, who was a tender, so not
Okay, not,
technically a
right,
keeper.
not technically keeper.
So the
okay.
tender was the person who supplied the lighthouses, but it was an interesting geographic location because it's in visibility of the Saugerties Lighthouse, so they could always see if somebody
Right.
was doing their job properly or not.
So if they would keep a watchful eye.
Right.
Okay, so now our two scarcely known female lighthouse keepers. Basically, I found Joanna Lackey in that list from the U.S. Coast Guard, and that was pretty much all I was able to find out about her. I was not even able to find a picture of this Kodak channel light, probably because it was more of a signal light. I don't think it had, in some of the account books I saw a reference to it, was referred to as a fixed light, which I think means that it did not have a rotating light, so maybe with less work, I don't know. And she's listed as Mrs. Joanna Lackey. So I'm presuming that, like many of our other female lighthouse keepers, her husband died and she took over as lighthouse keeper. Same thing with Mrs. Elisha Smith and the New Baltimore Stake Light. These are two lighthouses that were up in the Albany area, and we just don't know very much about them. But there they are for the record. They were women lighthouse keepers. Esopus Meadows, 1871. Esopus Meadows never officially had a female lighthouse keeper, but they did have, well, Miss Dory. So AndrewMcClintock was lighthouse keeper of the Esopus Meadows from 1926 to 1932, and his daughter Doris grew up in that lighthouse. That's a picture of her when she's about 6. She helped found the Save the Esopus Lighthouse Commission, which saved the Esopus Meadows Lighthouse from destruction back when it was a boarded up, slowly rotting wooden structure in the middle of the creek. And they based a lot of the interior restoration on her memories, which was pretty cool. And then in 2011, she published a little memoir called Dory of the Lighthouse, which I think is out of print now. We're trying to get it for a gift shop, so check back if anyone has any questions. And that is the end of my presentation.